Welcome to the ultimate dinosaur survival ecosystem. For 100 days, two of each creature in Jurassic World Evolution 3 will have to hunt, reproduce, and adapt to survive, or face the prospect of extinction. Watch as territories are claimed, battles unfold, and new generations rise to the throne. But the question remains, when the dust settles, will life find a way, or are they all doomed to die? Welcome to the survival ecosystem. And to tell you this story, it's time to take you back to day one. The first thing to do, of course, was to release two of every species, a male and a female, starting off with the herbivores and then moving on to the carnivores a little bit later. Once the plant eaters were incubating in the hatcheries, I added a truckload of plants, making sure they all had access to food and foliage that would have been present in their natural habitats. Water, of course, was equally as important, so many small lakes and ponds were added to help with their thirst. But beyond that, in the centre of the ecosystem is the sanctuary. Any dinosaurs who reach this oasis would have the best shot at survival. The sanctuary has a giant lake at its heart, filled with plentiful food sources and surrounded by nests where dinosaurs can drastically improve their odds of surviving by adding to their numbers. Rocks, hills and waterfalls were added to the immediate areas around the hatchery to create a more natural environment for our competitors to start in. Just a quick reminder before we go any further, this video is created using the brand new Jurassic World Evolution 3. If you haven't purchased the game yet and would like to, if you use my link in the description or scan the QR code on screen right now, every purchase does help support the channel. But anyway, it's now time to add the first creatures to our ecosystem. The first creatures out were a pair of ornithomimids, who I duly named Fluffy and Duffy, and they were followed out the door by a pair of oviraptors, who I named Ollie and Ovi. With a lot of species to release, I cracked on. From the weird and wonderful hybrid dinosaurs such as the Ankylodocus, to the giant sauropods that once ruled this world. Every single creature would have the opportunity to fight for survival, just as they had done 66 million years ago. Over the course of the first 5 days, I released an enormous amount of creatures, with the majority of them being friendly, and even smaller carnivores such as Coelophysis and Morus intrepidus would not be interested in snacking on any of our herbivores, who were just fighting to survive. Although some of them, such as Bell the Therizinosaurus, would be less tolerant of even innocent-minded herbivores being in their territory. It didn't take long though for life to find a way, as the first nest was claimed by the Sauropelta, who had laid a singular egg. For the majority of the creatures in this ecosystem, for their species to stand a chance of surviving, reproducing would be vital. We still had plenty more herbivores to release though, with some such as the Patago Titan, which would tower above the trees, peering down on the mere mortals below them. On day 7, from the nest, came our first signs of life. A single Sauropelta had hatched, and I brought its species total count up to 3. As he wandered out of the nest and into the world, I named him Sean. For little Sean, he would have to adapt fast, as trouble was always just around the corner. But the Sauropeltas weren't the only herbivores taking advantage of the lack of carnivores, as the Struthiomimus had also got busy and had laid 4 eggs, which would provide a mammoth upgrade to their species total count. For the residents of our ecosystem, life appeared to be good, but even with the lack of carnivores, it appeared that the dinosaurs were not content, and still insisted on fighting amongst themselves. When a rogue Chunkingosaurus got a little too close to little Sean, his mother stepped in and squared up to the smaller Stegosaur. The fight was a back and forth affair, with both creatures landing hits, but in the end it was a Sauropelta protecting her young that won. We hadn't even introduced any carnivores yet, and some creatures were now certain to go eventually extinct. With no mate anymore to continue the species, I named the remaining Chunkingosaurus Doomed, and then introduced the first carnivore of the ecosystem, the Albertosaurus. Despite being given a 10-day head start, not many creatures had actually made their way inland towards the sanctuary, and that meant for Albert and Ali the Albertosaurs, there would be plenty of hunting opportunities nearby. But the floodgates now had well and truly opened, and it was carnivore season in the ecosystem. I released some Troodons, followed by some Concavenators, who I named Cactus and Cameron. Next out were the famous Dilophosaurs, who can now poison their prey in Evolution 3, but my carnivore releasing was cut short when I already found a dead Troodon next to Loki the Lokiceratops. The Troodon, who had only been out of the hatchery about 5 minutes, had really let its mate down right there. But in some good news, from a singular egg, out came Dippy the Diplodocus. Dippy was entering an unforgiving, brutal world, and he would have to have all his wits about him to survive. Unfortunately, the Ankylodocuses didn't appear to have any wits about them, as despite having a massive club on their tail capable of breaking legs, they proceeded to be bullied constantly by the recently introduced Albertosaurs, and it wasn't long before they got their first kill. Elsewhere in the ecosystem, our concavenators were battling for alpha bragging rights, and I named our Utahraptors Univer and Unit, before getting back to filling our ecosystem with more carnivores, as I still had a lot of species to release. One of these species was the brand new species exclusive to Evolution 3, the Guanlong. I then did have to quickly check in on our Struthiomimus juveniles, as they had now hatched and were exploring the world. Elsewhere in the ecosystem, our newly introduced Herrerasaurs were not focusing on survival of their species, but rather fighting for the alpha position. Some of these species in this ecosystem really did need to get some serious team bonding time in there. But back to the carnivore releasing, and in the northeast of the ecosystem, a pair of Chengosauruses were released. Cousins of the Tyrannosaurus rex, and with an impossibly hard name to pronounce, these two would put up a good fight to claim the northeast territory for themselves. To the east, a pair of Atrociraptors were released, and these things always resulted in absolute carnage, and then quickly followed out nearby by a pair of Proceratosaurs, and then some actual Ceratosaurs, who were released in the southern part of our ecosystem, with plenty of nearby snacks for them to feast on. On day 15, I found something shocking. Instead of protecting poor Sean from all the nearby carnivores, his parents seemed to be focusing on their domestic, and were having a fight amongst themselves, over who truly was the best parent. But at least Dippy our Diplodocus was being well cared for, and he was looking absolutely adorable, following his parents wherever they went. Unfortunately later that day though, I did find a dead Homocephale, who had been hunted down by a Herrerasaur, but the carnivores were also taking out each other, as I also found a dead Dilophosaurus, who had been hunted down by Cameron the Concavenator. I checked in on Unit and Univer our Utahraptors, who were moving closer to the sanctuary and could actually be our first dinosaurs to reach that safety, where they would have ample food and nesting choices nearby. I then found Loki the Lokiceratops dancing on top of this wounded Troodon, which I did find to be rather disrespectful behaviour. Anyway, it was time to release some more carnivores, and we began with the Deinonychus, who became one of the numerous raptor species to join our ecosystem. I then released the Suchomimus, but was quickly pulled away from this as Beldoferazinosaurus was truly not happy, and was squaring up to an Iguanodon. This Iguanodon though was no slouch, and did get a hit in on Bell, but Bell was just far too strong, and the poor Iguanodon went down, just for walking a little bit too close for Bell. The next creature to get close to her should probably think again. Our vast ecosystem was now teeming with life, and also death. The Atrociraptors had taken down this poor Parasaurolophus, but there was little time to mourn this loss, as I caught Ali the Albertosaurus squaring up to this Ankylosaur. It was a one-sided fight, and as the Ankylosaur fled, she managed to survive the fight without a major injury, but also only 7% of her max HP. Thus I named her the fitting name of Survivor. With a lot of carnivores still to be added to our ecosystem, next out of the hatchery was the pride of Britain, the Baryonyx. I then caught the same Atrociraptor who had taken down the Parasaur, hunting down an Archaeonophomimus. This raptor was a serious menace, and it always seemed to look pretty peeved off with life, so I gave it the name of Angry. Anyway, back to releasing carnivores once more, as the beautiful Eutyrannus was released, followed by the fellow feathered dinosaur in the Pyroraptor, as clearly we didn't have enough raptors in this ecosystem by this point. But life was once more finding its way out of this large nesting site, as a baby Dreadnoughtus had hatched. It appeared that so far, the Dreadnoughtuses had taken advantage of the lack of apex carnivores truly capable of hunting them down, and had cracked on with ensuring the survival of their species. Back with our Atrociraptors, it appeared that Angry wasn't the only Atrociraptor who was up for trouble, as I caught his mate chasing down this poor defenseless Oviraptor before enjoying a light snack on it after taking it down. I then checked in on our Troodon with organ trauma that had previously been mercilessly taunted by Loki the Lokiceratops. At first I thought that it might be dead already, but it had obviously been having the best sleep ever, as it suddenly teleported up to its feet. Unfortunately though, this magic trick was not about to cure its organ trauma, and this Troodon was about to become one of the many species in this ecosystem to already go extinct. As she looked kinda scary, I named her Pennywise, as she lived out her final days. I then checked back in on Cameron the Concavenator, as he attempted to take out the final Dilophosaur, who did flee the battle, but wounded. With a few moments of peace now, the next morning was a quiet one, but it wouldn't be for long, as it was time to release the next barrage of new carnivores. We began by releasing the Spinoraptor into the ecosystem. As with the other hybrid dinosaurs, they would not be able to reproduce, but still had the ability to prove quite a threat to anything that crossed their path. Next out were the Dimetrodons, which were probably going to die within 5 minutes, but following them were a pair of Spinosaurs, who were released in nearby hatcheries. These Spinosaurs were duly named Nokia and Motorola. Normally being a solitary creature, it would be interesting to see if the Spinosaurs could find a way to get along to ensure the survival of their species. Day 30 though was a sad day, as Pennywise the Troodon had finally passed away from her organ trauma. The Troodons had truly become the meme of the ecosystem so far, but their presence will be missed. RIP to Pennywise, the first carnivore in existence to get mugged off by a Lokiceratops. But as the rain set in, we had some big news, as Unit the Utahraptor had found his way to the sanctuary. The question remained, however, as to whether Univer would follow him to this paradise or be left stranded on her own. The Pride of Britain didn't waste any time in getting its first kill, as I watched this Baryonyx take down this Pachycephalosaurus. But over with our Diplodocuses, panic had set in, as they had been discovered by Nokia the Spinosaur. Dippy had successfully made its way out of the carnage, but after cutting back to the action, I realised that Dippy's mum had sacrificed herself to save her son. Dippy was now alone, separated from his father also. He would have to learn to fend for himself, until hopefully one day he became an adult himself. But even being fully grown in this ecosystem couldn't save everyone. Ali the Albertosaur had seemingly claimed the southeast all to herself, and was busy winning yet another fight against the Ankylosaurus. In celebration of winning that fight, she decided to go and have a good bite on poor Bigfoot the Apatosaur's leg, which was completely uncalled for, and did leave poor Bigfoot with a minor fracture. And it wouldn't be getting any easier for this poor Apatosaur, as nearby a pair of Carnotaurs were released from the hatchery. Perhaps their only hope was that the Carnos and Albertos would take each other out for them. On the west side of the ecosystem, outstepped two tyrants, the Giganotosaurus. This large theropod from Argentina would be capable of taking on the largest of creatures in these lands, and would be a threat to all. But over in the northeast, we had some depressing news. Univer the Utahraptor had been murdered on her way to Sanctuary to meet up with her partner. It was a crushing blow, as Unit had been the first creature to make it to the safe haven. She had been killed by a Chenjosaurus, who I thus named Dreamkiller. Poor Unit would have to fight on all alone. In the south, the Spinoraptor was making a nuisance of herself, taking down this Dimetrodon, before rather amusingly being chased off by Motorola, who came steaming in the background. Back with the Albertosaurs though, they were up to more mischief once more, and I caught Albert next to the dead body of Poster, the Ankylodocus, who he had just fatally murdered. But nothing that had happened so far compared to this magic that I witnessed from this Giganotosaurus on the battlefield. I had no idea that we had such a wizard amongst us, as this was at Wingardium Leviosa the spell in real life. I thus of course named this Giga Harry Potter, despite being female. But with things ramping up in our ecosystem now, and a literal wizard on the field, it was time to introduce the Tyrant Lizard King to the ecosystem. These pair of Tyrannosaurs were named Maverick and Matilda, and they had the potential to form quite the duo, if they decided to of course. Back once more with what was becoming the star names of the ecosystem at this point, the Albertosaurs were causing all types of carnage. First biting the legs of poor Bigfoot once more, and then trying to take out the Ankylosaur once and for all. Magic did appear to be the theme of this ecosystem at this point, as I've never quite seen a takedown like this one. But this Albertosaur managed to get the job done, and finally, patience had been rewarded on this one. But back with Harry Potter, it appeared that his wand had stopped working for a while. I caught the end of this fight with the much smaller Suchomimus, but not only had he actually lost the fight, but he'd come out of it with organ trauma, meaning that their days in this ecosystem were numbered. But as we saw the end of one dinosaur, others were flourishing, as 3 baby Edmontosaurs hatched from a nest. In more good news, the Tyrannosaurs had officially become the first duo to make it to the Sanctuary, and there could be no better creatures. Matilda and Maverick would now have the pick of nests and ample food nearby to keep them fed, as long as they decided to remain in this territory. On the southeast, it was time for a new apex. 2 Acrocanthosaurs were released into the Albertosaur territory, as these Albertos seriously needed nerfing, and to face some real competition. A couple of miles west though, we had some very sad news. Dippy was dead. Hunted down by the ruthless hybrid Spinoraptors, this poor baby Diplodocus that had to fight on to survive on his own had passed away. I named the Spinoraptor who had done the deed Scaly, mainly so that we could celebrate when one day she hopefully died. I know I'm not meant to have favourites, but Dippy was truly special. I then watched a massive 4 Quenzisaurs hatch from a nest. This species were now dominating the northeast of this ecosystem, even if I can't pronounce the name properly. And with 4 more adults to potentially come one day, they had a real chance of making it right to the end. Unfortunately, one creature who would not make it to the end was Cameron the Concavinator, as I found his dead body. He had been hunted down by Motorola the Spinosaur after making a respectable impact in these lands. Talking about impact though, Angry the Atrociraptor was at it again. this time taking on a fight with the remaining Patchy. This time though, neither creature won the fight, both choosing to take the safe route out and walk away. Matilda then ran into Loki, who got his karma for dancing on Pennywise's body and got absolutely destroyed in one bite. But in these southern regions, an earthquake was coming. Not an actual earthquake, just a pair of Scorpius Rexes. The first one out was named Sadie, and she did nothing to help my opinion on hybrid dinosaurs, as the first thing she did when out of the hatchery was make a beeline for poor Sean, our baby Sauropelta. As you can probably imagine, Sean had no idea what had hit him, as he kneeled over, and he would not be getting back up from that one. The Baryonyx here had obviously heard the sad news about Sean's death, and held a minute's silence in the middle of the ecosystem, Sean. So with one hybrid already out causing chaos, in the northwest it was time to introduce another one, the Indoraptor. I released 2 of these things, and obviously while they wouldn't be able to breed, they still had more than enough potential to cause absolute chaos in these lands. In good news though, Maverick and Matilda had formed a lifetime bond, which meant that they wouldn't be able to mate with anyone else. Quite a good job to be honest, as they weren't going to have any other options. I celebrated this news by adding some sand to the sanctuary, as Matilda and Maverick were asking for some. I then caught Nokia and one of our Scorpius Rexes having a fight, and watched as Nokia landed a brilliant hit before running off for some reason. After inspecting her though, she clearly had made the right choice, as she had been poisoned by the hybrid monster. I added some more deep water for our piscivores, and then found the dead body of Motorola, the Spinosaur right next to Spiny, the Scorpius. These evil little things were truly turning the balance of power upside down in these lands. Apparently these stegosaurs though were unfazed by this, as they over and over again smacked each other with their phagomizers, which probably was not the most sensible of ideas when you have predators out there wanting you dead. The Indoraptor had also apparently attended Hogwarts, as he killed this Iguanodon by seemingly stamping on its foot. I named the wizard himself Indy, a truly original name right there. Despite having ample food in the sanctuary to keep him happy, as Alan Grant once said, T-Rex doesn't want to be fed, it wants to hunt. In the battle of scarcely surviving species, Unit faced off against the remaining Lokiceratops. A kill here would result in another species going extinct, but for now, both of them lived, as neither wanted to push themselves to the limit just yet. But they may have too soon, as out of a nearby hatchery came a pair of Metriacanthosaurs, and as one raptor species looked to be struggling, the Velociraptor was introduced to the ecosystem late in the day. The Tyrannosaurs, however, had finally done it. We had a baby Tyrannosaur in the ecosystem, and this young gun would be named Buck. He would have a long way to go, but if he could survive, the Tyrannosaurs would likely become the undisputed top dog of this land. Of course, Indy the Indoraptor may have something to say about that, however, and the Scorpius Rexes definitely did, as I caught them taking out Nokia, and thus making the Spinosaurs extinct once more. It had been a disappointing cameo from our Spinosaurs, who had not bonded together, and who had been utterly outclassed once the Scorpius Rexes were introduced. Down south, a battle of the Titans was emerging, as one of the Albertosaurs who had been so dominant in these lands so far were fighting an Acrocanthosaur. It was a heavily contested fight, with both dinosaurs landing big hits on the other. But in the end, chunkiness prevailed, as the Alberto fled the scene, leaving the Acro to roar in victory. But we didn't have long to enjoy this fight's scenes, as an even tastier fight was going on in the north. Maverick the Tyrannosaur was taking on Indy the Indoraptor. The fight seemed a hard call to make on the spot, with both creatures landing big hits. But with the largest bite force of any living creature, it was the Tyrannosaur who won the fight, and Indy limped away from the fight, seriously wounded. Elsewhere, a storm had now hit the ecosystem, which marked us going past day 50, and this Eutyrannus was squaring up to a Nasutoceratops. With both creatures giving it as good as they had, it ended up with the Nasutoceratops leaving the fight, and they were perhaps fortunate to do so only with a concussion. In the sanctuary, Buck was training for the Dinosaur Olympics, and was showing off some tremendous speed around the place as he sprinted over for a drink. But for young Buck, danger lurked nearby. In stormy conditions that night, outstepped a pair of Indominus Rexes. These creatures, famously claimed to kill for sport, would now be put to the test in the ultimate battle of survival. But our two hybrid monsters would have to wait to have their moment in the spotlight, as an Acrocanthosaur and Carnotaur were fighting in the southeast. The Acro landed a first hit, landing a big hit on the Carno, but the Carno hit back. As it eventually ended up running away wounded, I realised that this same Carnotaur had already taken out the other Acrocanthosaur, thus dooming this species forever. No wonder the remaining Acro was so upset with it. After taking out poor little Sean, Sadie the Scorpius Rex decided it was time to go after the parents, with one tail hit doing the job, but there was no time to mourn this loss, as over in the northeast, two giants had begun to fight. The King and the Pretender were fighting, and the Indoraptor was taking on the Indominus Rex. This Indoraptor was not the one who had been injured by Maverick, but rather a fully fresh one, and she was putting up quite the fight. In unbelievable scenes, the Indominus Rex ended up walking away from the fight, majorly wounded and with a minor fracture. Elsewhere, Mum and Dad were fighting, as our two Therizinosaurs were unhappy with the other one being too close. It appeared that this species were absolutely not planning on reproducing and instead hated the sight of each other, and thus were likely doomed to die. On day 60, the injured Indoraptor passed away. While her sister was thriving, she had been shown who was currently king of the ecosystem by Maverick the Tyrannosaur, and had passed away from her wounds. But while one hybrid creature was gone, the same could not be said for the Scorpius Rexes, who were still causing absolute carnage in the southern regions. But in news that shook the foundations of the ecosystem, the minor fracture the Indominus had suffered in its fight with the Indoraptor had now turned into an infected wound. Now bleeding health, it appeared that its time in these promised lands was soon to be drawing to a close. The Indoraptor, though, was not happy with just seemingly taking out one Indominus, so it made an unbelievable play on the other one. In a quite breathtaking performance, while I could scarcely believe what I was watching, the Indoraptor didn't just wound this time, but completely took down its much larger cousin. This Indoraptor was clearly made of scintillating stuff, and from this moment on, it would be named King, as I think we can all agree it deserves that title. After witnessing constant battles of the giants, a fight between the Squantosauruses and the Metriacanthosauruses seemed like a pretty low-key affair, until the fight ended and I realised that Dreamkiller had only gone and done it again. This dinosaur was determined to reach day 100, it appeared. But back with King, he had set his eyes on finishing the job. The already wounded Indominus was not feeling great about this fight, but thankfully for her, it was soon to be all over. King had done the unthinkable and toppled both Indominus Rexes all on his own. A scintillating effort from this Indoraptor, who appeared to have the best traits to be a born killer. But one dinosaur who had been with us for some time, but would no longer be making it to the end of the ecosystem, was Unit. The surviving Utahraptor had ran into the remaining Giganotosaurus, and it had not ended well for him. The Utahraptors were now once more extinct. And so were the Dilophosaurs, as I watched Cactus take out the remaining Dilo, who had now been completely taken out by the Concavenators. In some happy but sad news, 4 Metriacanthosaurs stumbled into the ecosystem. Thanks to Dreamkiller, these 4 Metrios would only be raised by a single parent, but perhaps one day they would grow up to get their revenge. Also in the vicinity were the Utahraptors, but rather than taking down Dreamkiller, they appeared to be interested in fighting more with each other. The Albertosaurs had been unusually quiet lately, but that was about to change, as I spectated a titanic battle between Ali and our remaining Acro. Ali did her best to hold her own in a back and forth battle, but eventually it was the Acro who once again came out on top. Albert, though, was still full of mischief, and was once more taking his anger out on the poor leg of a defenceless Apatosaur, who was already wounded as it was. But sadly, there would be no more Albertosaurs added to this ecosystem, as Ali passed away from the wounds of her fight with the Acrocanthosaur. These lands would be a quieter place without this girl around. Rest in peace, Ali. At least her body was a nice food source for this hungry Carnosaur here. Nearby, though, I found both our Ceratosaurs dead right next to each other. At first, I wondered what creature could have possibly been responsible for this massacre, but when I saw that both Scorpius Rexes had teamed up together right nearby, the answer to this one was rather obvious. These two were absolutely killing for sport. In a strange sighting, I caught our remaining Giganotosaur either taking pity on this Edmontosaur baby or running away in fear. Given how underwhelming the Gigas had been so far in this ecosystem, it honestly could have been either or. I checked in briefly on Buck the Tyrannosaur, and he seemed pretty happy with life, almost as happy as Albert, who was back once more doing his favourite pastime activity of munching some Apatosaur leg sandwich. I then found a Struthiomimus who had made it all the way to the sanctuary all on her own. This was clearly a smart cookie, so I gave her the name of Legend. Although it did just look like that Maverick had woken up from a nap and got her scent, so she may want to leave the sanctuary, to be honest with you. In one of the most disgraceful kill steals of all time, after Albert did all the hard work, this Carnotaur saw this Apatosaur as a free meal, and they would be completely correct, as some nice leg bites were enough to take them down. An Atrociraptor briefly walked by and thought about tucking in, but decided for now to leave the kill to the Carno. On day 80, I realised I'd forgot to introduce the Allosaurus. So about 60 days later than planned, welcome to the ecosystem, the Allosaurus. Let's see if they can have any impact in the remaining 20 days. Upon seeing that his favourite toy had been stolen from him, Albert was absolutely livid, and immediately squared up to the Carnotaur, who had stolen it from him. Fighting on pure rage, Albert was of course the winner, and the Carnotaur skulked off, only to be rushed right away by the two Atrociraptors, led of course by Angry. It was a quite brilliant move by the Atrociraptors, taking advantage of a wounded foe, and taking the Carno down. Albert then did briefly think about taking them on, before wisely deciding against it. This Suchomimus had obviously got bored of fishing around in the nearby rivers for fish, and fancied a change of diet, as I watched it run down this poor defenceless Dryosaur, who had done so well to survive this late stage of the ecosystem. The Atrociraptors were then back at it again, as Angry's mate killed some poor defenceless little thing, and I gave him the name of also Angry. If you haven't noticed by now, I did accidentally release 2 male Atrociraptors, so there is an argument here that I have stopped them from fully taking over the entire ecosystem. In a battle of the Titans, the Giganotosaurus was taking on the Stegosaurus. For once, the Giga did actually do something, and took home the win for South America, with the Stegosaur walking off seriously injured from the fight. As day 90 hit, our creatures prepared for a final 10-day onslaught to see who had the guts and will to survive the ultimate ecosystem experiment. Our Allosaurs had been wasting away for 60 days, and they wasted no time in attempting to make an impact by targeting Albert. Albert, as always, put up a very respectable fight, but he did walk away as a loser and with a minor fracture, which was never a good thing. There was some more life still to be added though, in the form of these 2 adorable Eutyrannuses. As their parents proudly watched on in the background, I named the 2 babies Yasmin and Rafa. With only 10 days to go now, they would hope to make it right to the very end. Rachel the Stegosaur had passed away from the wounds of her battle with the Giga, and King was back on the scene after a rather quiet period, and this time he was on the hunt. He was actually on the hunt for rather a long time, as he chased down his prey for quite some time, before performing a classic lethal pounce attack that had done for 2 Indominus Rexes already. Cactus the Concavenator was proving to have earned her spot in the final few days, as she took out one of our Guanlong with a brutal bite to the neck. That night, some more life continued to find its way into the ecosystem, with some Suchomimus babies. The Suchomimus had actually gone under the radar, but I realised that as well as taking out one of the Gigas, I'm not sure they had lost a single one yet, and there was a genuine case for them being the MVP of these lands. But it was all happening in the ecosystem tonight, as Dreamkiller was at it again. Squaring up to one of my adult parent Eutyrannuses, they fought back and forth, but when the fight ended, the male Yuti walked away with a major injury that would likely see the back of them, and leave poor Rafa and Yasmin without a father. The Dreadnoughtuses had also been busy, and they claimed another nesting ground, laying 2 eggs. Their firstborn, Dave, was also nearing adolescence, and would soon be able to fend for himself. I checked in briefly on our baby Suchos, and then named the surviving Giga Ryan, as I figured that he had earned himself a name at this point. Back with Albert though, he was desperately trying to stay alive, fending off advances from multiple creatures. This time it was the remaining Carnotaurus who was challenging him to a duel, but Albert stood his ground, and despite being wounded, took the win, with the bloody Carnotaurus taking its leave swiftly. But the never-ending duel between the Utis and the Quanzasaurs continued, and this time it was the mother Uti who was involved in the fight. She survived for now, but this fighting had left all the poor babies alone to look after themselves. As the morning began to filter through, the Carnotaur who had fought Albert passed away. Apparently this Carnotaur had starved to death, but Albert was certainly counting that as a kill in his CV. The Scorpius Rexes were of course still causing havoc, although as I watched these 2 monstrosities play together, I did realise their killing for sport had turned the once thriving southern lands into a barren land where barely any creatures had survived. Had these 2 gone too far was the question, and would their lust for killing be their eventual downfall? On the western side of our ecosystem, 2 more Dreadnoughtuses emerged from the nest, to be greeted by their parents and elder sibling Dave. This species was absolutely thriving, and clearly realised the importance of survival. Unfortunately, one of our Eutyrannuses had now passed away, and Albert was once more in the fight of his life. Already wounded still from the fight against the Carnotaur, Albert once more did what he always did and put up a great fight, but did have to retreat, somehow once more without an injury. With only days to go now until we hit day 100, could Albert make it to the end and survive against all odds? As our Suchomimuses had managed to take over an entire section of the ecosystem for themselves, I rewarded their hard-fought survival with a bit of deep water, where they could feed on the fish. But Ryan was not happy that his species line was going to end here, and started a fight with the very same Suchomimus that had taken out his mate. And this time, the much bulkier, stronger carnivore would not be denied, as the Suchomimus ran off with low health and suffering from internal bleeding. To his credit, Ryan had begun to put the Giganotosaurus back on the map. The unfortunate truth though was that this mother Suchomimus would never get to see any of her babies become adults. In a tragic tale of events, on the morning of day 99, Albert was hunted down once more by the Echocanthosaur, who couldn't claim these lands for himself until Albert was gone. Albert once more attempted to fight before fleeing desperately in hope of survival. He would unfortunately not be so lucky this time around. This legendary Albertosaurus passed away after so nearly battling his way to survival. Rest in peace, Albert, you are a true king. In more shocking news with only a day to go, it appeared that the actual king's days may also be numbered, as he was now starving. King had hunted everything around him for sport, and had thus been left with barren lands, with no food to eat at all. These Lystrosaurs were the only nearby creatures, but as they hid in the bushes nearby, if King could not work out where they were, he would surely perish. The Echocanthosaur who had bullied Albert soon realised that his problems were not over, as he wandered into Scorpius Rex territory. This playground bully though took one look at this devilish menace and decided he didn't want a piece of that, running as fast as possible in the other direction. In the sanctuary, Buck and his parents remained safe. Buck was now closing in on adolescence himself now, and just like the Dreadnoughtuses, the Tyrannosaurs had done a brilliant job of survival in these lands. Fittingly, as day 100 dawned, King the Indoraptor passed away. This legendary being that had perhaps saved the ecosystem from destruction was incapable of sniffing out some nearby Lystrosaurs that he needed to eat to survive. Rest in peace, King, and thank you for saving us from the Indominuses. That is the end of the very first Jurassic World Evolution 3 Survival Ecosystem Simulation. Remember, if you haven't purchased Evolution 3 yet and would like to, check out the link in the description, and also let me know in the comments who was your favourite creature of this 100-day journey. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day, guys, and why not watch the YouTube video on screen now? YouTube thinks that you will love it. Goodbye for now, and see you guys in the next one.